process works. So you can analyze a region or a space of an object or content. And there's three areas that these are really necessary in. That's things like speech analysis, syntactic analysis in text and data, that kind of stuff, and then stuff like DNA sequencing, all right? I think DNA sequence is a prime example here because no one individual base means anything. It's context, both in front and behind matter, but sometimes you have to have kind of a pretty open window of local memory. And that local memory process is a state process. So if you see here, f of h is the sequence, but not structurally, right? So we say, think about it this way as, instead of previously we were looking at the model oriented in this direction, right? Or Watt-Prussian model propagate this way. Instead, the model propagates this way, right? So we're actually looking at it effectively from the top or from the side, if you will. We're looking at each of the hidden states relative to an input, to an initial condition and an input, right? H naught starts off as the relative initialization layer, and then f of h at that moment is the state of the network as a result of the input for that time sequence. This x of I is not the normal x of I as a single feature. It's the feature vector at some time step 1, right? So x of 1 or x2, x3, each one of these are like a frame of a video. What we do is we look at the content of the frame of the video, and as a result, there is an output update, right? The model's weights or model's internal structure changes to try to adapt to the desired state process of the input. The output of that network becomes the input of the network again. Okay? These can also be drawn as a loop operating in this space, right? So you can say h of 1 becomes, so h naught is the original state, right? Mm-hmm. This is f of h. Notice f of h has not changed, but the weights have been updated. So it's the same network, but it's taking input from its previous state, right? So what it adapted to, how its state worked, it actually, so if you could call this, like if you look at it in a neural network, its dendrites actually connect back to the soma, right? It has a portion of it that loops back in on itself. That is actually how memory formation works within synaptic systems in the brain. We have loops that reinforce the strength of the activation for certain features and certain patterns of features. So now the patterns previously were spatial, now the patterns are temporal. We're finding changes in the spatial pattern as the time sequence changes, right? Something transforms, moves, scales, rotates, whatever else involved in the process. We're able to identify it by comparing it to what we previously output, as well as what the new input is, right? So we have new input plus memory of what happened beforehand. And at every step of the process, we keep adding a memory back to the system. So the output keeps being the input of the next subsequent state of the process until the sequence has been processed. Yes?
Would this be somewhat treated like is this like a time variant system then to some extent?
I think that there are time variant operations versions of RNNs. There's a couple of different types of them. TDNNs are time delayed neural networks, and they are time variant state update processes. So yes, I would say yes, you can make that. Structurally, so time is the feature we're using here, factor we're using here, but you can say syntax as well, right? So anything about the previous state understanding that gets propagated into the next time frame, the next processing sequence, it does vary with time. So these are not fixed in terms of saying that either structurally or connectively they will have uniform weights. The network, once trained, has this interesting characteristic that it adjusts for what to keep as a result of each of these processes, all right? But let me go on to talk about something else. Maybe this will help kind of concrete for you. these time sequence systems are missing some elements at play. And we noticed something. We noticed that the input state for each of the relevant hidden layers at that time step is just the output of that same layer at that time step. It doesn't really have something that sort of sets aside necessary information and then processes the new information sort of in a raw way or takes it as its own whole. So they actually implemented some additional systems, we'll talk about those in a minute, called LSTM networks that allow for side memory storage, right? But yeah, you have a question?
I just wanted to know what like the hardware for this would look like, because if you're running at like 30 frames a second, I mean, it's got to process that imagery pretty quick to keep up.
So we're allowed to share, in GPUs, we're allowed to share memory. Like previously, all they did is just shared memory. So the weights of the system are network connectivity, right?
Okay.
So nodal connectivity. You could approximate this in something like a smart routed system, to effectively move the outputs of the weights of the system. But I've seen people who have developed these with like FPGA type controls, where they're routing the output of the system through like an FPGA control system and then linking it back. But the other thing that's interesting about this is because there is a dependency, frame by frame dependency, I can't necessarily run this in any kind of parallel state, right? I can't really parallelize it because it is blocking. Each of these state update operations is blocking for the next frame operation. You have to keep these relatively small with respect to how the dimensionality of the inputs is. And that's a limitation for their utilization with something like CNNs or other spatial processing. You have to do the feature extraction step with these, right? So these are a little bit older technology. The newer ones that we'll talk about in just a minute kind of fix this problem, but we can do something like image captioning, which allows us to find semantic feature characteristics. First, we identify something like the larger scale elements, like the environment that the individual is in, and then we might find that there is a motorcycle. We can identify that. Then we identify human on the motorcycle, and then we use syntactic analysis, looking at it as kind of moving through the sequence of the system, moving through the frame of the images, at treating the input frame, right? Each input frame of the system as its own output state that's pushed through the system, and at each frame we try to create an understanding of what's currently happening. So typically whenever you see something like this running, it'll start off with a rough inference from the first frame or two, and then as it gets further along in the system, it's going to keep adjusting its guess. It's like you're watching someone walking towards you. In the beginning, they're tiny at a distance, right? You can't verify that you know for sure who that person is, but you think you know who they are, right? You get that guess in the beginning of your brain. Fun thing about it is, a lot of times we're right, because we can pick out even from really low resolution, really low temporal data, somebody's walk cycle. Like we can pick their gait out from other individuals. That's a crazy, crazy good capacity that humans have for that kind of pattern recognition, temporal pattern recognition. Okay, so structurally, that is like an automated process that we don't necessarily think that we have, but we have it. And then as the person gets closer and closer, you get more and more confident about what's being established from that. So as you go through the sequence of the system, you start off with a rough guess, you get a little bit more refined, you get even more refined, and then you're confident at the output, right? You're going to constantly increase the likelihood and reliability. Structural semantic analysis does something like looking through a sequence of a review for something like IMDb or something like that, and tries to find words, sentences, fragments, phrases that generally indicate whether the person thought that the film was good or bad, right? So we're trying to add a sentiment analysis to that particular statement. And this is funny that sentiment analysis is used frequently in stuff like analyzing Twitter for stock trading, right? If you can tell that people are generally, happy about it, think like there's good chatter on the web, from Reddit to your stock forum posting to X, Twitter, whatever it is now. If you scrape all those sources and then use that sentiment analysis, sometimes it can give you sort of feelings about what the general trend of that particular stock might be doing in the future. And we already know about machine translation. Everybody's pretty familiar with it. It's a many-to-many system where you have a sequence of words, concepts, phrases, and you might be actually converting to a entirely new linguistic base in order to be able to move things around, like grammar and accents and those kind of things. Bidirectional RNNs suffer a little bit of a problem in that they can't run on live data, right? You can't run on live data. You can run on closed data. But a bidirectional allows for both a forward and a backwards propagation layer for the estimation, right? So you look at one frame, and then you go to the next frame. You found something in the next frame, and you go, hold on, wait, let me look back and check and make sure that that wasn't there, right? And you can actually move forward and backwards through the data in order to increase your confidence by moving forward and backwards through the system, right? Providing additional context about how certain key elements of the frame or of the temporal characteristics have changed in order to increase the confidence and the understanding of how the structure is moving or transforming within the space. This is useful whenever you want to get the advantage of the forward prop layer characteristics and temporal understanding, but the self-correcting capacity of backpropagation. Yes?
Was this built off of like Markov? Because I mean, looking at that formula, it looks very similar to what we looked at yesterday.
It is. It has Markov. So Markov chains are the foundation of much of recurrence because of the fact that they do have this compute framework, right? Both the forward and backwards propagation effectively say where you could be and what would have happened given where you could be at this process. Ultimately, what ends up happening at the end of these training processes is they reach a steady state, right? They can no longer adapt any further because they've learned as much from that particular image or set frame of images as they can. Then you have to move on to the next frame. But like I said, this one has a limitation in the effect that it cannot work in online training, right? It kind of can, but not really, right? We typically train this offline, meaning that in order to have true full backwards and forwards prop through the system, you have to have the whole sample. Like you have to drop the whole sample in. So I have to give you a video clip to train on. Now, once it's trained on that video clip, you don't have to have the back propagation capacity anymore, so you can just run it in pure forward prop. This is just the training segment of the bidirectional operation. Now, one thing that these are used for in the effect that you're going to give it a whole sample is translation. So sometimes you're reading through a sentence, right? And you say, Gary was unable to put his bowling ball in the bag because it was too big, right? You're saying, what was too big, the bag or the bowling ball or Gary, right? So the computer doesn't have that context in our minds of which proper noun, which structure item is really being referenced to. So you'd have to go forward and backwards. You'd have to go, okay, what's the likelihood that this it or this, his, here's a bad one, right? Tom was consoling Gary because he was feeling sad. Who was feeling sad? Gary was sad, right? But we get that because of the fact that we went forward and backwards in our head and figured out who it would be, right? Sometimes the system might be inclined to just take the most recent reference or propagate to the most recent reference, right? So we have to have the forward and backwards capacity to keep context to provide us with something like the likelihood of that particular pronoun referring to that particular individual in the sentence, okay? Long-term, short-term memories are a cool system. I'm going to talk about them for literally 1 minute here, all right? They contain a memory cell that is alongside of the runtime of the system and is updated internally. That contains an input gate, an output gate, and a forget gate. They look a bit like this, all right? So this isn't a perfect opportunity, but the memory cells you see run in parallel of the actual operating state of the system. Current state comes in, is processed by a integration operator and is the current level of the input state, whatever is in the memory, can either be forgotten, it can be provided as an adjustable output to the system, right? So the current state goes directly to output, or it can be created as a new input to the system. This says, forget the thing that you thought was important previously. This says, this is independent of the memory, and this says, this modifies the memory, right? You notice the connectivity. The forget gate stops the integration of the memory as part of the output at the new system, because we notice whatever's in the side memory here, let's look at the output. Whatever's in the side memory in there impacts the output of the system. If I tell the system to forget what it saw beforehand, before I put something through the output gate, then that particular memory, that particular piece of information won't be included in the next calculation. But this allows us to keep track of things, objects, elements, spatial characteristics. This is an array with indefinite size based upon the characteristics of the system. It can be really big, and it can track objects, structures, frequencies, elements, whatever is in place, but having a memory that travels along with the active process allows us to have a long-term as well as a short-term internal memory to work with. So this starts to mimic a lot more of how our neurological processes are operating. Okay? Sorry, I know that's quick, but I gotta get through this because we've got other stuff to do. All right, so transformer networks. Pretty much everything that you see in the GSM, LMM, LLM, and generative modeling space are types of transformers, right? GPTs, ALPTs, natural language processing systems, those are transformers. What does the transformer have that the LSTM doesn't? That is this notion of an attention system. So from sentence to sentence, perhaps, what is the most significant structural elements and what are the pronoun objects and reference characteristics that are necessary to keep track of what's going on in the space change. So from paragraph to paragraph, who you're talking about, what they're doing, what amount of context you need from previous information changes. So this system will adapt over time to find new objects of interest, new items as things change throughout the system. So it creates a method of attention. It says, pay attention to this. This no longer matters. It's a kind of forget system, but it also incentivizes the model to look for certain types of activations, certain patterns, certain frequencies. So this is a very, very high level in terms of the interpretation processing. This is groups of patterns moving together being tracked. So this system is able to include and exclude, move in and out whole patterns of systems, and characterize, add and remove, and then track multiple attention systems. There is a process allowing provisional embedding, meaning that the initial framework has both what word is included there and where the word is included in the sequence. So the embedding process starts with that framework. And then the system takes the positional encoding, right, who's in front, who's behind, and then it can actually break everything up into little chunks of information. They can be overlapping chunks, and you can actually parallelize the processing of huge chunks of text or structural information by allowing everybody to know where their information is relative to everybody else, and then we can sequence them together, allowing each individual chunk of that system to input to the larger sequential processing framework. This allows us to parallelize the operation that we were dealing with recurrence. So as long as we have an understanding of what's important from the attention framework, which that's the interesting part of it, all of the chunks of the processing systems of a transformer network can access each other's memory relative to the attention system. So they can say what they thought was important, and then they can communicate with their adjacent neighbors as to what are the most significant elements, right? They can include a specific token and the association of that token to other elements. Tokens just like the name of, or the specific referent of a word or a proper noun, something like that. Okay, multi-head attention systems help overcome vanishing gradient by creating more localized understandings of the system, keeping attention to smaller localized subsystems. GANs are the next logical step from attention-driven networks in the effect of saying that the structure of something like an image largely just requires you to keep track of what we were looking at beforehand and making a structural inference on what is likely to come next with it from an associated framework. Mechanisms for GANs, or generative adversarial networks, utilize a forward propagation mechanism to create first the system we call a discriminator. The discriminator is trained on a variety of real images, huge corpuses of data, in the billions upon billions of images. Right? Pretty much the entire internet has been used for some of these, like DALL-E and Midjourney. Right? Anything, everything that's publicly accessible in Google basically has been included in this. Interesting part about
copyright infringement. Copyright infringement.
There is an interesting aspect to it, right? Is it a copyright infringement? Because if I'm not intending to actually take anything that you've created that's unique and reproduce it, then I'm only creating something based upon the generalized concepts of what you're working with, which is fair use.
That's according to not what's being happened.
That's a fair point, right? The thing is, there's a difference between how people are using it and how it's intended to be constructed, and it's a loophole in the law, right? One of the things that's important about legal process is that you can't actually legislate how someone is going to use a tool, right, that you don't prescribe to them limitations for, right? You say,
right,
it's not my fault you misused it, right? So from the perspective of legal protections, those who are programming and training these systems are actually able to sidestep those legal protections because the generated content is not under any kind of licensure. It's not created by a person, and thus it's not able to be copyrighted in its own sense. So you're not allowed to use it for marketing and sales purposes. You can't create a logo or something like that and then go and market your company with it because you're not able to trademark things that are produced by generative processes. All right, so we are sidestepping some of that. But there is a ethical
That's what we were talking about yesterday.
Yeah, so the ethical ramification here is if I don't own it and I use it to create this model, doesn't that model technically contain the information that was originally in that system? Matter of fact, just like we've talked about a lot of other models, it is just, the model is liquid here, right? It's just taking on the shape of its container. So you pour it around it and it creates a mold, right? It creates a mold by being poured around all the things on the internet. Technically, you take the mold away, the only reason why that mold exists is because those things existed. It is nothing new. It is not actually truly generative in any sense. It's just recombinatorial. It takes the information it has and novelly recombines it. That novel recombination framework takes this consideration of a generator. Now, a lot of people don't understand this generator is basically the discriminator initially flipped on its head and run backwards. So what normally would have been the outputs are now the inputs, right? Classes of information. So you remember we had softmax. We said it was this much duck, this much sports car, this much airplane, right? Now we can create a system that has the inputs, what should normally have been the discriminator, right? And outputting what the class was. Now the class input is back here, right? So I start off with some random noise on this end, right? I tell it what class of image I would like to have. Those become the inputs to the system. I prime the pump by just giving it some randomness to create what the surface looks like. And then I tell it specifically how that information is supposed to flow through that network. The process of doing this now is called something called stable diffusion, which attempts to control the localized gradients all on the back propagation, right? So propagating through the network in the forward process, we're going to control the flow of information to sort of not flow up any hills. So the system gets more and more capable of of adjusting the weights in the back propagation system by having the generator hooked up to the discriminator, and then when the discriminator says that the output says it's fake, right? What's the generator do? Generator says, I need to update the weights. I didn't do it quite right. So it goes back, rethinks the process, adjusts the weights based upon that classification of either true or false, fake or real, and the system gets better and better. This is the art critic, this is the forger, all right? They're sitting in opposite rooms of one another. The critic tries to get better at detecting fakes. The forger just gets better at creating them. And eventually this arms race, this process of just constantly exchanging pictures across the system, creates something that is capable of very closely discriminating things that have been modified from one another, right? But also in making things that are so real or so close to real images that they're virtually indiscernible, right? Deep fakes and all the other stuff we're dealing with now is a consequence of some genius thinking up this idea, okay? I don't know if it's a good, bad idea. I feel like one of those things where it's like, sometimes, I'll tell you guys some of the things I think about sometimes.
Should we have a therapist in the room or somebody like that?
We are his thing.
Maybe for you. Yeah, you guys are.
Oh, I can't. They've already tried to help me.
Sometimes the thing you think about is like what we do to the rest of the world. Now, you know, you guys are up to the level as far as much what I can teach you about most of this stuff. We've got a few things to do, but what we do looks like magic. You know, in comparison, think about what this even looked like 10 years ago. It looked like you had a magic wand. Like I can create something that's virtually indiscernible from reality in seconds. That's crazy, all right?
Tom Hanks is suing over
yes.
a commercial that he was in that he didn't actually star in.
They used his likeness to reconstruct it based upon 3D scans.
And he's got enough video out there to get the voice and everything.
The thing that I said, the stable diffusion models, all the reconstruction stuff, all right? So what I'm saying is, if you think about it this way, right? Magic is kind of those things, like magic isn't good or bad, it's the person using the magic that uses it for good or bad, okay? That's where I'm looking at it, is I'm teaching you guys the magic, you have to have the morality to understand whether you're gonna be, you know, Dumbledore or Voldemort. Right, that's the
So
only
is
options
it
you have in life, is Dumbledore or Voldemort.
So it's the
Very
companies.
binary.
So it's the companies who are programming it in a manner to.
Corporations have no morality. Corporations have no compass.
Then why do they have an
corporations
ethical
no intellectual
code?
integrity, right? You guys do. You guys are.
They do that to appease people, so that they
Exactly.
can keep making money.
Yeah.
They can pretend like they have scruples.
Just like how ChatGPT does, okay?
Well, they just recently
You
changed
said-
theirs.
You say to ChatGPT, I think that's wrong, and it goes, oh, I'm sorry, and fixes it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's still wrong. I
You
just
know,
told you
guys
to
know
do the
why?
wrong
You
thing.
guys know why that happens, right? I'll tell you guys this
Statistical,
one.
right?
Last thing. It's not statistical, it's time.
Time.
It ran out of time. Okay?
Oh, it's timed out after a
It
certain.
times out. It has to time out because what would
Oh,
happen?
it'll just get
It's
stuck.
technically an infinite search space. The information corpus of all natural reality is gigantic. Okay? So what do? We say you're playing chess, right? Do we let the chess robot play the rest of the game until all end configurations, all 10 to the 56th possible configurations from most mid-game settings? Mid-game. It's 10 to the 124th-ish for a characteristic branching factor. That is more than like all known atoms in the universe by a second order power. It's forever. It's for the number of configurations that can happen is unreal. So you have a theoretically infinite search space, right? We say countable infinity. And we go, how long would it take to search that? We don't have that kind of time. So what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to do the best you can with what you've got. Think about a self-driving car. You don't have forever. You've got the baby with the stroller or the old man in the street and it's slick and you gotta make a decision, okay? You have to do it now. If you don't, to quote Rush, right? You choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So we have to do what we can with what we've got. So when the system runs, it says, provide me a solution within a reasonable run time. And if it can't find something that makes sense, or it's not converging to something that makes sense, it's just gonna start giving you what it has, what it's got access to, the best solution it was able to come up with based upon before it ran out of time, right? It gets to cheat a little bit by elongation, by creating that sort of sequential output. By the way, that's mostly fake. They slow that down to actually slow down the process of how many requests those APIs are getting. They produce that output like that, right? That chain of sequence likelihoods, that chain of probabilities
that's just for
is
show.
already established. That typing is just for show, okay? So it's already established that by the time it starts typing. So its frame window is milliseconds. So when you ask it to do it again, what does it do? It utilizes the context of the information it already has. It already has its understanding of that space that it was searching, and it now knows that the node it went to, or the direction it went in, wasn't the right one, so it chooses a different branch with the extra time that it's been allocated. You keep allocating it extra time, it should theoretically narrow in on a better and better appraisal. Now, sometimes it will do what it's been doing of late with ChatGPT-4, which is one that I read the other day, was somebody goes, the code didn't work whenever I tried it, and GPT-4 says, well, it worked when I ran it.
Is that actually what it is?
Yes, I saw it the other day. I do not want sarcastic robots. No sarcastic robots, okay? There's some other slides on here for you guys. So,
that's good.
But I'm going to try to do something in the next 2 minutes. All right?
Are we rushing through some more?
Huh? Are we rushing through something? No.
Okay.
Yes,
Whew.
yes we are.
Yes. Great.
Yes, we
Wonderful.
totally are rushing through something. Do I have this on here? Where's the keypad? This may not even be possible given the time we have, but I just wanted to talk to you guys about something else. At least get it started. We'll start with my examples first of something. I'm doing this a little out of order, but I want to talk about something about the idea of working with a different kind of data than we've been working with. Typically, when we encounter something like this kind of data, right? Like this one is a series of bacterial growth curves, right? When we encounter the process of something working in natural space, we tend to think that the same constraints, the same systems operate, right? But sometimes you'll come across certain structures that actually change based upon the time window or change based upon the context. So they perform in one way or behave in one way in one setting, and then behave in a different way somewhere else. This is interesting because you can't really create one model for non-deterministic systems. If context matters or sequence matters, or if the behavior changes as time changes, then you're going to need a different model based upon each of those behavioral ranges. The example I give, and the example that I'm going to talk with you guys about, I'm going to talk to you guys about how to implement this when we get back. But the example that I'm going to give you guys here is bacterial growth. All right? Why would bacterial growth be of interest to us? Well, it's a huge thing. It's pretty much all disease in humanity, not all of it, but a good chunk of it is contributed to or is a big issue of bacterial growth. They're both good and bad, right? They help us digest our food. They keep our skin from getting invaded by other more nefarious bacteria. But if you get a cut and those bacteria get a little overzealous, and they infect your tissues, then you can get gangrene or something else like that and lose a limb, right? So back in the day before we had antibiotics, we weren't able to really fight this system. But notice a couple of things are happening here. First, that blue phase in the beginning. That's lag. That's whenever the first inoculation happens, whenever the first bacteria shows up. And we notice there's a very linear operation curve there. Tiny, tiny amount of self-replication of the bacteria. As soon as it hits kind of this little weird break point, right? When the formation has finally gotten a foothold, notice what happens. Growth becomes exponential during that period. Could you model those two things with the same function? No, you're gonna have to handle it in a piecewise way. So the cool advantage about this is that we were already dealing with this. Neural networks deal with it as a piecewise operation as well, right? Breaking things up into combinations and recombinations of linearities. So we're actually gonna employ a similar process, but by our traditional methodologies. We're gonna crank back the complexity and make them more interpretable. So if you think about it, depending on where you place those delineations between those regions, you can get better or worse understanding of what's happening within that phase. The cool thing about this is if you understand what's happening in that phase, you understand the rate of propagation, you understand the rate of division, you can tell the difference between two different types of bacteria. Tell the difference between them, and via that process you can prescribe which of the antibiotics is best. Some of them are good at destroying adult cells. Some of them are good at destroying cells during their division phases. Some of them are good at destroying the cellular walls that make up that bacteria when they start to divide from one another, right? So attacking many of the bacteria in their exponential phase is ideal, but it's also hard sometimes to detect things that early in the phase. So the cycle works such that the exponential growth goes up, and then it stops exponentially growing, partially for two reasons. One, first, it poisons itself with its own waste. There's too many of them. They overcrowd, they poison each other. Then they run out of food, right? Then we end up with a stationary phase where the relative growth is effectively flat, right? The rate of increase stops, the population stays pretty static, and then the population starts to fall off again in the death phase. Now, during the death phase, you can actually end up with additional proliferation or reinfection from the same group. So these things can be chained throughout, increase, decrease, seasonal operation, especially as the bacteria is proliferating throughout different regions of the body. So if we see it in one area and we want to stop it elsewhere, we can figure out what it looks like and where the best places to attack it are based upon the characteristics of its performance within those regions. So we're going to talk about selection of those cut points, called knots. We're going to talk about how we model things within the regions in between those cut points, called bases. And then we're going to create multiple basis functions. We're going to show how we can just treat them as additive by effectively turning on or off some segment of the model based upon which zone of the system you're in. Say, treat this part as linear, this part is exponential, this part is linear with maybe a small quadratic element in place, and then this one as a decaying exponential or as a decaying logarithm, right? We'll deal with that. I'll show you guys how to do that. That's relatively straightforward, and it's just a matter of combining the tricks we've looked at beforehand together in order to make a more complex system that allows us to better model anything that you're likely to encounter in the real world. So most systems require some sort of analytic at this level, whether you're dealing with real things, living biology, human behavior, etc., in order to analyze, the interaction or the progress of that system over time.
And then you turn it off with an autoclave.
Yeah, exactly. Turn the whole thing on. One of the things I saw recently is they've been using nanotechnology, right? You create a nano material that responds to a specific wavelength of light that human tissue is permeable to, and then you get the bacteria to absorb that nanomaterial, and then when you shine that light at it, it converts that light into vibration, which effectively turns it into heat or infrared radiation, right? So you go from like super long wave infrared that passes freely through the skin to shorter wave infrared that effectively fries everything around it by heating up from the inside. So you create an internal autoclave. So if you can get something like a cancer cell to absorb that little material, the quantum interaction characteristics of what they call plasmonic particle will actually cook that thing from the inside, microwave it.
That's what they use for my psoriasis. I use UVB light, and I have a special thing that the VA gave me that I stand in front of.
Yep.
And it's basically the same thing. It's like a mild sunburn just to burn off the psoriasis.
Yeah, the funny thing about it is that the cells that are more prone to psoriatic activity, which is higher cellular division rate, are actually more fragile, right? So cells that are more genetically undifferentiated will be less robust. Cancer cells, for instance, part of the reason why cancer sucks is because cells are programmed to do something called autocrenation, right? They effectively commit seppuku, they go, "Ah!" When they get too big or too old, right? And so then they just blow up. But cancer, a lot of cancers just turn that gene off. And they say, never die, never kill yourself. Cancer is like eternal cells. Problem is that as you get older, cells go from like, a little smart car, like up to like a Prius, and then they become like a van, and then like a semi-truck, right? At the end of the time, they're just like a tank, right? They're super slow, super big, super inefficient structurally. And, they got all these little whippy little cells around the outside of them. How you kill them is by saying that those little cells are more robust, they'll survive things that particular cell would die with. So you do something like chemo, the bigger cell absorbs more of the chemo, and since it's fatter and hungrier, it eats more of that stuff and it eventually kills it. Whereas the smaller cells, they don't eat as much of it, and they can handle a little bit of toxicity. So they get a little sick, and they cough a little bit, and then they spit it back out, right? Whereas the big cancer cells, eventually, they eat so much it kills them. So you poison everybody, but the really old, slow ones die because they're greedy.
I actually had a question about, I found a way
Thank you.
to
Take care.
implement
Let's see if I can get things taken care of for class expansion today.
Oh,
I'm gonna go talk to Greg.
oh, awesome, thank you so much.
So I found a way for the forward and backward to run it through a for loop,
Uh-huh.
just so I can kind of look at the data, but I'm running into a console issue. It will only display, I've got a pretty big feature set, it's 30 features.
There is a memory limit to how much the buffer for the output of the R console
Is there a
can
way
hold.
to change that and to use maybe my
chunk it.
computer?
You have to chunk it. You have to chunk it up.
Okay, because
there's
I
a
did
way
1
to.
through 5.
There's a way effectively that can treat it like a pause function.
I even tried to
Do you
save it
need
to.
that information?
I was doing it so I could kind of see how the forward and the backward change as features are added or taken
How
away.
many features are you dealing with?
30.
That shouldn't create a problem for display.
Because it's only showing like the 5. And so that I've done it a few times, so I would chunk it out and then
Maybe that's
array
part of
that.
it. I wonder if that's part of the built-in.
I mean, it's huge, it's just.
No,
a bunch of-
I'm wondering if the prop function has a limit on how much it prints.
It may be, I tried using the print function instead of just typing the variable
The
itself.
LV, yeah, okay.
And then my other question is I'm trying to add that for loop and that list array to my graph so I can see how it goes, because I've been doing it individually and it sucks doing it individually to see how the graph, the RSS
So
and
the
the
loops aren't
adjusted.
working, or?
Well, it won't do, like the for loop, I don't know if I'm using the wrong plot or if I'm coding it in wrong. I'm not sure where the I variable that's iterated through goes
You can send me
into.
code, I'll take a look at it.
Okay,
Do
'cause-
that's probably the best in the circumstance we have, because
or do I not need to iterate to show it all on one plot? Because I just want it to plot like all 30 different.
my thing that I will tell you is this: I would prefer you to do as much as you think is necessary, but at the same time, don't kill yourself on the process.
Right.
If you sort of trust the process a little bit and assume that you're getting most of the information you need from that initial 5 selection or whatever, but if you want to see how it's changing throughout the process, you get a better picture of it.
Right.
At the same time, I think you're probably already going above and beyond what we were utilizing in those other labs.
I may be, but I
You
think
are.
for understanding.
I have
it's-
noticed, especially this semester, because we started off with a more robust, like, go and really look in depth, on those labs to do it yourself. And again, I think that changed the way people have approached it, especially with the final project. I'm seeing people making more effort to try to understand it and get it and use it as a tool. So, that I appreciate, but at the same time, treat this like you would a report for your boss, right?
Keep it simple.
Keep it relatively simple, keep it targeted, and then if, worst comes to worst, if I do have a question about the way you did something, I might ask you, but at the same time, it really is gonna be a situation where I'm gonna ask myself, and I've already talked with my TA about it. We're just gonna keep it at the high level of saying, was the effort there, was the implementation correct, is the feedback and input about that information there. Talk about the challenges you're encountering using R, right? Say, I try to do this, I experienced this problem, right? That's informative. That tells me what you did. It tells me also ultimately where I might be able to solve that problem for someone else in the future. But you can send it to me.
Sentences.
Yeah, that's kind of how I wrote it up. Is like, tell me what worked, what didn't, what you're gonna change again if you could, and whether or not you think that particular problem contributed to any of the error that you're seeing in the system, right? Was it reducible as a result of methodology, or is it irreducible as a result of inherent data restrictions within the system?
Right.
So,
Okay. Well, and I've been leaving everything in there that I attempt in my code, just so I assume
I
that
look
somebody
through
with
it.
my level
I
of
look
knowledge
through it,
would
and-
look
and
through
so
it
is
and be
Rowan.
able to tell, oh, I see what he's
Rowan's
trying to
actually
do.
really good at R. Like, he did really well whenever he was going through the class, so he's been able to really work with it. And he's been doing most of your labs. I look through them occasionally just to see where things are at, but I trust his judgment.
Right.
And he said that people are doing well, so I've been looking at it, and
I think it's just a few little edge cases where I have to turn to Google and be like, why is ggplot not working?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And the
go
thing
ahead.
is like, ChatGPT is not a solution.
Oh, I don't even.
It doesn't have enough R. It doesn't have enough R.
Well, and we don't, like, even at work, like, I found out the other day at Honeywell, we have R. That baffled me. Not that it
R is
should
tiny.
have.
R is tiny.
It's
And they will
really
include
small,
it, yeah.
but it kind of
It's like
surprised me
200
because they have MATLAB too.
Yeah,
And you can do a lot of the same stuff on MATLAB.
you can run R code in MATLAB. In MATLAB, you don't have to do anything about it. It has a native run option in MATLAB.
Wow.
Yeah, and you can wrapper R code and run it in Python or C.
Yeah, I knew you could do Python. I didn't know you could do C as well.
So,
Yeah, it'll run C. It'll run C internally in R as well. If it's strict C, if it's C11 or earlier, you can run C code in R.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Sure.
So,
Talk to you next week.
Yep.
so he has
Have a good
more
weekend.
questions.
Hey, John.
John,
Hold on a second.
Oh,
so you have 4 questions, I have 3 questions.
well, maybe that's a difference because you're a master's. Like, I had a drop-down window that said for linear regression, for feature selection.
You're in a different class. You're in a different class.
Ah.
Yes. Don't worry about it. You're
Okay.
So-
So I gave you the drop-down menus because I want you guys to stick with the ones I gave you.
Right.
I gave them the option to be able to run open-ended. They can either use the ones I gave them,
Or they can go
find
search
their own.
for another one.
Yes, but
Gotcha.
those, the thing is, like, those were highly curated. My TA spent like 15 hours last year going through all the data sets, all the basic
Yeah,
data
you
sets
put
in
on
Kaggle, and those ones that we put on there were like the links to the Kaggle descriptor set for ones that were considered to be good ease of use, good interpretability, and relatively stable at low levels.
Right.
So I wanted you to stick with those. I didn't want you to select something else. That was the quiz that I gave, or the quiz you guys have is the same as the one that I gave last year.
Gotcha.
But this year I gave them an open-ended option.
Okay.
So,
Oh,
Because you guys had 3 drop-downs and 1 descriptor at the bottom of it as an explanation of what you're going to use.
Right.
Yep, exactly.
so we can out of this data, we can select any other data.
You can select anything you want. I said specifically on there you can use, or I think I did. I said on there that you can use
Yes, you
ISLR2 and Max.
And you have 2 submission links open. Do you want us to submit the final project to both? Is one for ECE, one for graduate? Because they
What do you mean,
both
2
say,
submission links?
We can see here.
he'll show you, he's got it pulled up, but when you click on it, they're the exact same. But they both say 80 points, they both say final.
One says final project data set and the other one's final project.
Right here. Oh, Well, it doesn't do that on his, but mine shows final
I'll
project
look at yours.
twice. And I mean, if nothing else, I could just submit it to both of them and then be done with it.
One's enough, I'll fix it later.
No, that's
I'll
fine.
fix it post, okay? So Canvas never plays fair with me. I can, even if I grade it and then I have to put it in its own column later on, it's fine, as long as it gets submitted. it's fine.
Canvas is not fair with you this semester.
Canvas isn't fair with anybody. just me, I get the short end of the stick.
Okay.
I don't know why, because most other technology and I get along well. Canvas and I do not, we don't interface.
Luckily, I've never had that pleasure or terror of having to interface with it other than on the student side.
Yeah, do you have other instructors, like your other instructors ever have problems with Canvas?
Yes.
Oh.
Oh, I mean, I've never heard them openly complain about it. I'm not saying that they don't, but
Are they galvanized?
Kirkpatrick-
Is there some training that I missed that we're not supposed to complain about it?
I don't know, but Kirkpatrick and Gully and
Kirkpatrick is not an example. Kirkpatrick has been here since virtually
Well,
the beginning.
okay,
I've been here
maybe
37 years.
Dr. Beard is a good example. He just doesn't use it. He literally uses the file share feature and that is it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we've talked about it. He and I have talked about it. He does not like it. He does use Panopto though.
He does. And I like that though.
Kirkpatrick used to just use Panopto. He just used to tape his lectures. He didn't have any slides whenever I took his classes.
I'm okay with that. I like to be able, if something's bugging me, to go back and rewatch it, and because even though I'm trying to follow every word you're saying, if I'm writing, I'm still missing part of the input.
Well, bear this in mind. Next week we're going to do GAMS on Monday. We're going to do trees on Wednesday, and we're going to do SVMs on Friday. So we're literally doing one.
Do we have to do them in that order, or can we switch it?
Huh?
Because SVMs are on the final project. Can we do those Monday?
No.
No.
So are trees and generalized additive models.
Are they?
Yeah. Yeah. Here
I just saw
we're-
trees and SVMs.
Trees and SVMs are on there, and SVMs they're the last thing you have to do. It's
It's
in that order. It's in that order on the.
I'm gonna try to have that done this weekend,
Okay.
so we'll see.
Go ahead, get ahead of yourself. You better get to reading.
So the question we need to answer it, and we're getting the 20% marks here.
Correct.
Okay. Another question is the topic, the deep learning, the slide you have given us.
Yes.
So it's going to be included in the final.
Yes, absolutely. We've spent almost 2 weeks on it. It is 100% on the final. I will have questions for you about it. I will describe to you
And all
the
the last
regions
three
that I
chapters?
consider the most important, but honestly, that's 80-ish slides. That's about 2 chapters worth of material, so I'd weight it that way.
Yeah.
But trees, GAMS, and SVMs are going to be similar, but I'm going to tell you very specifically what the scope is going to be on those. I will tell you what the topics are and the subsets, and I will give you guys questions. The problem is that I'm going to give you guys a study guide right now, which is going to be a quiz. And I will not have all of the material for it covered until Friday. So everybody wants to think, oh, I need to be able to study now a week ahead of time for the final. And it's like, yes, but we're going to be doing material for the final all the way up to Friday, right? So study everything we've done so far up to now, all the way through deep learning. So it's going to be feature selection and projection and normalization, right? As well as all of that feature-driven regression. And then we're going to have deep learning stuff, and then I said as what I just described, which was GAMS, trees, and SVMs, which they're just versions of what we're already doing. They're just different versions. SVMs are probably the only thing that is the most different out of everything we're doing. I probably spent a little bit, truth be told, I probably spent a little bit too much time on the deep learning stuff. But at the same time, I think since we went through the deep learning stuff, I think it's going to make stuff for the trees